And we are live. All right, good evening, everybody. Council members, welcome. Members of the public, welcome as well to this meeting of Troy City Council that will be held virtually this evening for Monday, June 1st, 2020. It is 7 o'clock. My name is William Lutz. I am President of Council. I am here at the City Building with Sue Knight, our Clerk of Council, Patrick Titterington, Director of Public Service and Safety, and City Auditor John Frigge. This time we will begin with the invocation and Pledge of Allegiance given tonight by Council Member Bobby Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. President. May we all bow our heads, please. Our Heavenly Father, would you please take into consideration the calming effect that you can have on this world and our country. Help us to heal the wounds that are so ever present and on our minds on a daily basis. Please wrap your arms around us for the medical issues that we're dealing with today and in our local community, in our state, and our nation. Please protect us, and we thank you for your guidance and your words of wisdom. In these words I pray, amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll this evening?
Mr. Swayzer.
Here.
Mrs. C.
Here.
Mr. Phillips.
Present.
Sievert.
Here.
Mr. Schilling.
Here.
Mr. Twilliger.
Here.
Mr. Allen.
Present.
Mr. Roselle.
Here.
Mr. Twist.
Here.
All members of council are present.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We will begin tonight's meeting with the public hearing ordinance 028-2020. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the title of the ordinance?
Ordinance number 028-2020, an ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D08057-920 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classification of R4 single family residential district to OC1 office commercial district. This is the address of 430 Kirk Lane.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. I will also report that we have received one comment on this particular public hearing item. I will read that comment. Dear Ms. Knight, I am in receipt of your letter about a zoning change. I am the current homeowner located at 425 Miami Street, Troy, Ohio, 45373. I currently oppose the zoning change for the property located at 430 Kirk Lane. I welcome Mr. Ray's input about information that is planned. Additionally, I am seeking more information about what the parking structure will look like for the surrounding area. In conclusion, I am opposing the zoning change for 430 Kirk Lane. I am placing my contact information on file with your department. Thank you, Mr. Allen, for those comments. Have we received any other comments?
No, sir.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. This will close the public hearing. Mrs. Knight, will you please read a summary of minutes of the May 18th, 2020 meeting of Troy City Council?
Minutes of council, May 18, 2020. Committee reports. Community and Economic Development Committee recommended entering into the 2020 CHIP partnership agreement with the county and Piqua and TIP. Community Partnerships Committee recommended that legislation be prepared accepting the parcel of 124 Ash Street next to Lincoln Community Center. Finance Committee recommended that legislation be prepared amending the ordinances to establish a payment plan for delinquent bills to be paid that is longer than the current plan allows. Recreation and Parks Committee recommended legislation be prepared granting an easement to DPNL at Waco Park. There was also a discussion regarding ordinance number 013-2020, a piece of land. which was then discussed. Resolution number R32, 2020, adopting the ADA transition plan, was given second reading and adopted. Resolution number R33, 2020, entering into the CHIP partnership agreement, was given first reading and was adopted. Ordinance number 013, 2020, declaring a piece of property as surplus, was given sixth title reading. Ordinance number 025, 2020, accepting a parcel at 124 Ash Street, was given first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 026, 2020, enacting new section 909.05 of the codified ordinances regarding payment plans for delinquent utility bills, was given first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 027, 2020, granting DPNL an easement at Buckle Park, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 028, 2020, a change of zoning for the parcel located at 430 Kirk Lane, was given first reading. Following various comments, council adjourned at 7:28 p.m.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We will entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Sievert to approve the minutes of the May 18th, 2020 meeting of council. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We will move on to committee reports. We have 6 reports this evening. The first 3 reports are from the Buildings and Utilities Committee with Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen, please go ahead.
Thank you, President Lutz. Number 1, on May 26th, this committee met remotely to discuss the Hobart Arena bidding authorization. And they're recommending bidding authorization for the replacement of lower east side roof of the Hobart Arena. This budget includes the replacement of both side roofs. In considering budget savings, it was determined that the west roof can be deferred until 2021, but the lower east roof has exceeded its useful lifespan and the condition indicates it needs to be replaced this year. There's a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Troy Recreation Board to advertise for bids, enter into a contract for the replacement of the lower east roof of the Hobart Arena at a cost not to exceed $120,000. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Terwilliger, Mr. Twist, and myself as chairman of the Building and Utilities Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Do any council members have any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, Mr. Allen, please go ahead with your second report this evening.
Thank you. This one's in regards to demolition of the city-owned properties on 110 East Canal Street and 212 South Mulberry Street. On May 26th, this committee met remotely to consider recommending bidding authorization for the demolition of 2 city-owned structures located on the properties on which new fire station number 1 will be constructed. We note that the current estimate exceeds the budgeted amount, but funds are available for the project due to budgetary savings. There's a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the demolition of city-owned structures at 110 East Canal Street and 212 South Mulberry Street at a cost not to exceed $350,000. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Terwilliger, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair of the Buildings and Utilities Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Do any council members have any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, Mr. Allen, please go with your final report this evening.
Thank you. Professional services agreement with Hazen and Sawyer for design of blower replacement project at wastewater treatment plant. On May 26th, this committee met remotely to consider recommending approval of professional services agreement with the firm of Hazen and Sawyer for the design of the blower replacement project at the wastewater treatment plant. The estimate of $222,000 exceeds the budgeted amount. However, the project scope was expanded based on the request of the city as noted in the detailed report. It is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public and Safety to enter into a professional services agreement with Hazen and Sawyer of Cincinnati, Ohio, to perform a hydraulic process model, evaluate secondary treatment options, and provide design and bidding assistance for the blower replacement project at the wastewater treatment plant at a cost not to exceed $222,000. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Terwilliger, Mr. Twist, and myself as Chair of the Buildings and Utilities Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Are there any comments or questions on this report? We'll move on to the Community and Economic Development Committee with Mrs. Lynn Snee. Mrs. Snee, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Community and Economic Development Committee met on May 26th remotely to review information regarding applications for Community Development Block Grant or CDBG funding. The city is eligible to receive $150,000 for qualifying projects under the program year 2020 Community Development Allocation Program for the projects outlined in the detailed report. In addition, the city is eligible to compete for up to $500,000 of program year 2020 CDBG Critical Infrastructure Program funds. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to submit applications to the Ohio Development Services Agency, or ODSA, for $150,000 of program year 2020 CDBG Community Development Allocation Program funds for the projects listed in the detailed report, and for $500,000 of program year 2020 CDBG Critical Infrastructure Program funds for the Madison Street Lift Station project. As both CDBG applications are due to ODSA on June 17th, 2020, this committee supports emergency legislation. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozell, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Do any council members have any comments or questions on this report? Mr. Rozell, you appear to be frozen. Do you have any comments or questions?
It looks like he just disappeared.
We lost Mr. Rozell.
All right, and per Mr. Kerber, we need to
Take a
stop
pause.
and wait till he gets back on.
An alien abduction.
That's correct.
There
he is.
Hey, there he is. Mr. Rozell, you are muted.
Hey, that'll be happy for a lot of you.
There you are.
Mr. Rozell, did you hear Mrs. Snee's report, and did you have any comments or questions?
Most of it, no, I don't have any questions.
Okay. All right. Moving on to the Community Partnerships Committee, and it is Mr. Rozell. Mr. Rozell, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This committee, Community Partnerships Committee, met on May 26th remotely to consider the amended lease between the Community Improvement Corporation of Troy, Ohio, CIC, and the city regarding the CIC handling the lease of the property known as Lincoln Community Center, LCC. The amendment would include the address of 124 Ash Street in the lease, as LCC recently transferred that property to the city, and clarify maintenance responsibilities of the city and the LCC for the property outlined in the lease. It is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared accepting the recommendation of the Community Improvement Board to amend the lease between the CIC and the city regarding Lincoln Community Center, and authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to execute any documents related thereto. It is the recommendation in this associated with this expansion project, Lincoln Community Center, that is ready to commence. Committee supports emergency legislation so that the project can remain on schedule. This is respectfully submitted Zach Allen, John Schweizer, and myself as chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rozell. Do any council members have any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll go to the last report this evening with the Streets and Sidewalks Committee and Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, sir. On May 28th, this committee met to consider the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission that a 14-foot wide unimproved alley west of 124 Ash Street and 130.5 Ash Street be vacated. This alley is part of the new construction project at Lincoln Community Center. and the abutting property owners are the city and the center itself. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared approving the vacation of a 14-foot wide unimproved alley west of 124 Ash Street and 130 and a half Ash Street. This committee supports emergency legislation as the alley vacation is part of the new expansion project of Lincoln Community Center, which is now starting, and the project should not be delayed. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Schilling, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Do any council members have any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we will close the committee reports section of our meeting tonight, and we will move on to resolutions. Mrs. Knight, will you please read resolution R34, 2020?
Resolution number R34, 2020. Resolution authorizing the Recreation Board of the City of Troy, Ohio to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the replacement of the east side roof of the Hobart Arena, cost not to exceed $120,000. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Before we go on, I should have asked if there were any citizen comments on any committee reports this evening.
No, sir, we did not receive.
Right. Thank you. Council members, how do we wish to dispose of the item?
Move to suspend. Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Terwilliger and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to suspend the 3 reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The 3 reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the resolution, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Do any council members have any final questions on the item? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read resolution R35, 2020?
Resolution number R35, 2020. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the demolition of city-owned structures. These are the structures at 212 South Mulberry Street, 110 East Canal Street. First reading.
Council members, how do you wish to dispose of the item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the 3 reading rule by Mr. Schweizer, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Second.
The 3 reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Terwilliger and seconded by Mr. Sievert. Do any council members have any final comments or questions on the resolution? Seeing none, Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read resolution R36, 2020?
Resolution number R36, 2020. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio to enter into an agreement for professional services with Hazen and Sawyer of Cincinnati, Ohio to provide design services for the wastewater treatment plant blower replacement project, cost not to exceed $222,000. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How do council members wish to dispose of the item?
Move to
Move to
suspend.
second.
It has been moved by Mr. Schilling and seconded by Mr. Twist to suspend the 3-reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
Second.
The 3-reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Terwilliger and seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any comments or questions on the item?
Close.
Oh, sorry. I apologize. Are there any comments or questions on the item? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R37, 2020?
Resolution number R37, 2020. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to file an application for the use of PY 2020 Community Development Block Grant Funds and declaring an emergency. This would provide for the allocation of $150,000 of CDBG funds. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How do we wish to dispose of the item tonight?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the 3-reading rule by Mr. Schwazer, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
The 3-reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt by Mr. Rozell, and I believe it was seconded by Mr. Schwazer. Are there any comments or questions on this item before we vote? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R38, 2020?
Resolution number R38, 2020. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to file an application for the use of PY 2020 Community Development Block Grant Critical Infrastructure Program funds for the Madison Street Lift Station Repair Project and declaring an emergency. This provides for the application of the funds for the stated project. This is the first reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How do we wish to dispose of the item tonight?
move to suspend,
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the 3-reading rule by Mrs. Snee and seconded by Mr. Siebert. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
The 3-reading rule has been suspended. Are there
Move
any?
to adopt. Move to adopt.
Second.
It has been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Terwilliger. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead.
yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Excellent. That concludes our resolutions for the evening. We move on to ordinances. And we have ordinance 013-2020. And before I ask Mrs. Knight to read the title of the ordinance, there was a bit of a question procedurally that came up, and possibly Mr. Kerber can help us answer this question. Are we required to have a supermajority vote in order for the ordinance to be adopted, since this involves the sale of property?
Yes, Mr. President, the passage of this ordinance requires a affirmative 2/3 vote, which would be 6.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Kerber. With that information, Mrs. Knight, will you please read the ordinance?
Ordinance number 013-2020. Ordinance declaring municipally owned real property as no longer needed for municipal purposes and authorizing the sale of such excess property. This has been recommended for approval by the Board of Park Commissioners to sell a parcel from Archer Park. This would be the 7th reading.
Council members, this is the 7th reading. How do we wish to dispose of the item?
Mr. Lutz, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
It's my understanding after the last meeting that staff had asked for a 2-week period of time to explore certain items such as formation of process and procedures, and to engage in certain items that they wanted to explore. Could you, prior to the vote, let us know whether that has occurred, or could Patrick discuss whether that has occurred, as I think it is important for council's knowledge before we proceed on this vote today?
Sure. So city staff has begun at the request of the park board, the investigation. That investigation will be presented to the park board tomorrow at their executive session that they have scheduled. The policies, there's a draft set of policies for the park board to review and hopefully recommend tomorrow afternoon as well. And the staff has been inventorying the park properties to determine who owns it, where the boundaries are in general, and then and more specifically where there may be encroachments, and have physically gone and toured all but 2 or 3 properties. So we're well along in all of those things. And so we don't feel pressed for going to an 8th reading in 2 weeks.
Has the investigation then been concluded, except for the presentation to the park board?
The investigation at this point, as far as our piece of it, unless the park board asks for more information, Mr. Funderburg will be presenting his findings, his recommendations to them. Ultimately, disposition is up to the park board. But as far as the staff reviews, the staff investigation, we feel it's substantially complete.
Okay, so the 3 items that you wanted us to delay upon have now all occurred. Is that fair?
They are very well along, yes.
Thank you. I move to adopt, or I don't, Mr. Lutz, can you explain, is this an affirmative vote? Because the committee report was a little confusing from last time.
I would appreciate, for everybody's clarity, a motion to adopt the ordinance. That way a yes vote is a yes vote and a no vote is a no vote.
Then I move to adopt the ordinance.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Sievert to adopt the ordinance, seconded by Mr. Twist.
Roselle.
Okay.
Wrong bill, Bill.
Okay, Mr. Roselle, you both spoke up, and I see the yellow box before I hear the voice. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
No.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
yes,
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, council members. We are moving on to ordinance 028-2020. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the ordinance?
Ordinance number 028-2020, an ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D08057-920 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classification of R4 Single Family Residential District to OC1 Office Commercial District. This is the address of 430 Kirk Lane, has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. This will be on the committee agenda next Monday to provide a recommendation to council.
Excellent. Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We did have a public hearing on this item earlier this evening. This will stand as the second reading. Mrs. Knight, will you please read your ordinance 029-2020?
Ordinance number 029-2020, an ordinance vacating a portion of an unimproved 14-foot alley located west of 124 Ash Street and 130 and a half Ash Street in the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This is adjacent to Lincoln Community Center, has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission, first reading.
How do council members wish to dispose of the item this evening?
Move to suspend.
second,
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Sievert and seconded by Mrs. Sneed. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
The three reading rule has been suspended.
Move to adopt.
second,
It has been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Twist and seconded by Mrs. Sneed. Are there any final comments or questions on this item? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 030-2020?
Ordinance number 030-2020. Ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an amended lease with the Community Improvement Corporation of Troy, Ohio, regarding lease of the Lincoln Community Center facility. An emergency. This has also been recommended by the CIC board. First reading.
How do council members wish to dispose of the item tonight?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Rozell and seconded by Mr. Schwazer. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger.
Yes. Move to adopt. Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Schwazer, seconded by Mr. Terwilliger. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the last ordinance of the evening, 031-2020?
Ordinance number 031, 2020. An ordinance changing the zoning of parcel numbers D08 026290 and D08 026300 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classification of R6 two-family residential district to OC1 office commercial district. This is at the address of 6 North Madison Street. The rezoning has been recommended by the Troy Planning Commission. There will be a public hearing at the next council meeting, first reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. And since there will be a public hearing at the next meeting, this will stand as the first reading. We conclude our ordinances this evening. Mrs. Knight, are there any communications or announcements?
No, sir, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Moving on to comments, we have online Mayor Robin Oda. Mayor Oda is hopefully unmuting herself right now. There she is. Hopefully she can. Mayor Oda, do you have any comments or questions tonight?
Just a couple of comments regarding the Archer Park property. I'm disappointed about how we got to this point in 7 readings, but I think we're well on our way to providing a policy that will educate city employees and residents about encroachments on city property. Probably these things should have been in place before, but we'll draw a line in the sand now and move forward from here. And hopefully we don't have this issue again. The other thing, I know Patrick will probably mention the reverse angle parking that's getting ready to be instituted. This is part of our planning for the West Main Street project. The city was given $2.5 million from ODOT from their safety fund. And part of receiving those dollars means that we need to implement safety procedures. And this is one of the things that has been suggested. So we will be doing a pilot program in a couple different places in downtown Troy. I would encourage everybody to take the time to check these out. We'll announce those locations when they're ready. The first location will be Short Street by the courthouse, and that'll be there a month before the other one takes place. But take some time. It'll be a change of thought. It'll be a change of process for you, but it is a safer way to get out into traffic. I've been down to Dayton myself to try it. And it's just a thought change that we need to think about. So that's all I have for you.
Thank you, Mayor. Director of Public Service and Safety, Mr. Titterington.
I'm not sure I should add to the reverse angle parking discussion. But if you have feedback, if people have feedback, residents, whoever, then they need to email those to us, to ODOT, to whoever, probably to the engineering office, and let us know positive or negative so that we can communicate that to ODOT. It is not an exact requirement. It's not an absolute, but we have not heard much comment other than kind of background noise, if you will, and for it to count either in favor or opposed to it, we need something that we can share with ODOT. So that's enough on that one. A couple of other things. Since we are slowly ramping back up with our downtown business activity, we have started parking control again. We sent something out on social media on Friday. This week, unless there's something egregious that's happening, like somebody is sticking out into the driving lane, we are trying to be nice about it and give warnings and just get people back into the groove, if you will, of having some parking discipline. And then next week we'll really start with our regular enforcement activities. At, I believe it was the last council meeting, we talked about council authorized extending utility payment plans to a maximum of 180 days from 90 days. One of the aspects of that ordinance change included the ability to put together administratively a grant program. Can't share the details because we don't have the details yet, but we are working on something and hope to have something out soon. We have not reinstituted shutoffs of utility bills for non-payment of utility bills, but we expect that that is going to start once the state changes their procedures. And so we want to be in a position to have people come in, make appointments, talk it through, and talk about how we can help them and how we can work with them to get current. Our number of outstanding bills is still quite high, much higher than it is on a normal average month, but it is trending in the correct direction. So we feel positive about that. We think that with some kind of a grant program, we can really affect the bottom line positively. The third thing is to, you see on our items of interest every 2 weeks a calendar of the current month. You should note that we have tentative plans to have our first concert of the year out at Treasure Island on the 26th of June. We are working with the health district on how we can do that. We are also discussing whether or not it would be feasible for us to have some activities the weekend of July 4th, starting on the 3rd with First Friday, and doing something perhaps downtown, and then having a concert, having a parade downtown on the 4th, and then a concert and the fireworks the evening of the 4th. I won't speak for Mayor Oda, but I will say that of the things I just mentioned, unless weather negatively impacts, we are definitely having the fireworks. We are planning on having the concert or concerts, but we're hoping to get a lot more clarity in the next week or two about social distancing, gatherings, whether we call the gathering a reception or a free speech, or maybe we'll start with a church service. And, you know, we're going to try to be creative without getting Mr. Kerber too worried. But stay tuned for that. So you'll be hearing more about that in the next week or so. That's all I have. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Titterington. Moving on to Director of Law, Mr. Kerber. Do you have anything to add this evening?
I really don't have anything to add. I like the idea of additional things to do this summer. I think everybody's looking forward to it. So I'll do my best not to get in the way.
Thank you, Mr. Kerber. Also with us this evening is Mr. Frigge, our auditor. Mr. Frigge, do you have anything to add?
Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Frigge. I just have a couple quick comments. I will not be here on June 15th, so Mr. Phillips will quarterback the process. There we go. I'm planning to be take a few days off with the family, going down to Kentucky for a while. What's that? Bourbon trip? No, I don't think so. Also, I've had a few questions on how long are we going to continue to do this?
Yes.
And the general feeling is that we have a lot of public hearings. These public hearings are advertised to property owners of adjoining properties of the parcels that are under discussion. And in those notices that we send out, we tell folks that these meetings will be held virtually. So I don't think it's fair to those residents that we send a letter to say, we'll have a virtual meeting and then change and say, no, we're not. We have one scheduled for June 15th. There may be one for the first meeting in July as well. There will be for the first one of July. So hopefully by the second meeting in July, we will be back at City Hall. Do any council members have any comments or questions this evening?
Mr. President.
Oh, go ahead.
Mrs. Snee, go ahead.
Just a quick follow on to Mr. Titterington's comments. In looking at the items of interest, the only thing that I had a question about that I didn't hear mentioned is the farmers market. Are the plans for that to start the date that we see, June 13th?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee.
I have a comment, Mr. Lester, a
Seaver.
question.
Mr. Seaver,
Thank
go
you. I guess I have primarily a question, maybe to the mayor, but definitely to Patrick. So when I went to a local East Main Street business owner's place today, I was inquired as to how to make the comments relative to the reverse angle parking known and whom they should be directed to. Obviously, that's not a council decision, and council has no impact on that process. So I advised this person that they should direct them to Patrick, to you, or should they send them to ODOT? I guess this lady wants to know where she should send her concerns, as well as the number of elderly customers that come to her establishment to express her concerns about the rear angle parking.
Sure. So for ease and the least amount of confusion, if they send it to us at City Hall, it can be either to me, to Jill, it can be on through the website, whatever. We will compile those and make sure that ODOT gets them.
Okay. And as a follow-up, I just want to make sure that this is correct. This is a pilot program for ODOT to glean feedback. So it's kind of one of those, shame on you if you stay quiet. You just got to make your voice known, whether you like it or disapprove of it. But ODOT needs to gather information from the citizens relative to the continuation of this project once it's initiated. Is that fair?
That's fair. I mean, it is something that locally we have initiated to help ODOT understand how people feel. And they really haven't gotten a good sense of that from the discussions that have been held, the public meeting that's been held. And so this is just one more way for people to understand what that's all about, because a lot of people don't know what that means and what it is, and to really experiment with it and then give us some informed feedback.
Yeah, Todd, it's not just for ODOT, it's for us to know, to see how it works, to get for what it would be like here in Troy.
No, I understand. I just want to make sure that the people know if they ask us about it as council members, the best thing we can do is refer them to you, because we don't really have any say on this process.
Yes,
it's not a legislative process.
Right. But you can have them email me, they can call, we can take a message over the phone. And I'm sure there's probably, Jill, I don't know if maybe you can allude to this. There may be a phone number they can call or an email address. We will advertise that. We will
we are putting out something on social media to let people know what we're doing. We're also going to be talking or emailing at least the county to give them a heads up, since the first pilot is going to be on North Short Street. So we'll make sure that all the contact points are in the press release.
Yes.
Well, just so you're aware, the newspaper has already reported that it'll be on East Main Street. So I don't know whether you were aware of that or not, but that's in today's paper or on Facebook today.
Second location at the end of July.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sievert. Any other council members have any comments or questions tonight? Seeing none, do we have any city staff members with any comments tonight? Feel free to unmute yourself if you wish. No one appears to be unmuting themselves. Mrs. Knight, have we received any citizens' comments via email for any subject?
No, sir.
We have not. Well, at this time, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you all for showing up. Council members, residents, everyone, thank you.
Thanks, Bill.